old are you anyway? And what she had done was put all of those things together and concluded that I must surely be at least 107 years old. In fact, as the local officials know, much of the time I was a local official, I was also teaching at the university, so there's a great overlap there, and I'm really not 107 years old. Let me thank you for the invitation, and Sue, thank you for your work and the work that your associates at the planning department have been doing. I appreciate it very much. I will tell you, one of the issues facing America today, and of increasing concern to so many people, and in many ways dividing the country, is the growing economic inequity in our country. It is not only about the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few, and then a few companies, a few families, but it is also about the challenge and inequity that is facing the average American on a day-to-day basis. And it's something that communities really feel these challenges more than any other area in the issue of housing and transportation. And it's the nexus of those two that bring that inequity question right home to the average American. And it's not just the poor, the very poor, and not even just the working families. It is truly middle-class America that is facing these challenges and having increasing concern about it. And so families now find themselves, and individuals find themselves working more jobs or longer hours just to meet the closely related housing and transportation needs and costs, and they feel much less comfortable about the ability to help their children through college, and they feel less comfortable what's going to happen after college, where they're going to have a place to live, where their parents are going to live in the community, and so on. Now, having said all that, let me suggest that tonight we'll leave the complicated tax policy and economic policy to those at the national level. We have enough challenges probably right here. There are, however, very clear policies and changes that we can do at the state local level that will help provide some solutions to this challenge facing Americans, and particularly about providing a range of housing costs and reducing transportation costs, and recognizing the nexus between transportation and housing and what it means for the average family. And this is issues facing Greensboro in a major way, but it is also issues facing communities all across the country. A housing and transportation mix that will help provide a range of housing and transportation options, and a shared prosperity is doable. And let me put the emphasis, if I might, on the shared prosperity. It doesn't do any good if we hit a real boom and a portion of the population really starts moving ahead in terms of economics and opportunity open to them, and others continue to struggle. And that's why we're here this evening. Before we go into too much detail, let me just very quickly tell you about Smart Growth America. We are a nonprofit. It grew out of the environmental movement, but most importantly, we are a coalition of organizations now all across the country that are facing exactly these issues, and that are trying to address the issue of how do you, in fact, move ahead in an environmentally sensitive way, recognizing things like climate change, and how do you move ahead in a way that's sustainable and that has housing opportunities and job opportunities and transportation opportunities for all citizens. And these coalitions are working both at the local level, state level, but also coming together on a regular basis at the national level. We also have coalitions of business groups that work with us, because Smart Growth is, in fact, a bottom line, both for the public sector and private sector, effective way, efficient way to move ahead. What we're really talking about is smart growth as an approach to development that encourages a mix of business types and uses. It encourages diverse housing and transportation options, and it encourages development within existing neighborhoods and community engagement to make those neighborhoods work. We believe that quality of life is better when people can live and work close to their jobs, their shops, their schools, and everything else. And we also believe that it works better when people can have access to great, safe transportation options, to complete streets, and to economic development and the jobs that go with it. I would emphasize, I say this in just about every community, and it was really so clear to me as I drove around this afternoon. Russ Flagg was nice enough to, Russ was nice enough to drive me around and show me a number of different areas. But one of the points that I make is that we could have in this city the largest construction boom ever realized in Greensboro for the next 25 years, and not take down one more tree or pave over one more farm or sprawl out into our wonderful open space. And if you don't believe that, just walk around just about any corner and look at the asphalt, look at the underutilized spaces and so on. And we're not talking about the Manhattanization. We're just talking about good, smart, well thought through infill growth and development. As we discuss some of the trends and tools of smart growth, let me come right to the heart of what one of the bigger issues is. And for our elected officials here, and Councilwoman and Mayor, you know this well, and that is the issue of density. Density is at the heart of so much of what we'll be discussing. Americans really do know what they like and what they do not like about land use. They're very clear of it. They don't like sprawl, and they'll fight against it. And they don't like density, and they'll fight against it. Now, if you stop and think about it for a bit, you're going to have one or the other, or you're going to have a totally stagnant community where your children and your parents will not be able to stay. And so what we recognize is that when we say density, we're not, as I mentioned, talking about the Manhattanization of the world. We are, in fact, saying density relative to the scale, to the context of the community and of the neighborhood. And so what we should recognize in terms of talking about density is that there are certain rules and approaches that can make it work. And I'll be coming back to these in my comments. But one is to make sure that there is meaningful citizen participation in the decisions that are made that impact their community. I mean, they're concerned about density because they live there, and they have a certain view of density, and in many cases they don't like it. And so what we have to do is work with the community meaningfully for participation to reach the conclusions and where the boundaries of growth should be, and how the boundaries should mix with the next neighborhood and the different type of housing in there. The second part that is so important is that of trust. There must be trust between the community and not just the elected officials, but the whole government. And the reason we say trust is if you're saying, and I've seen this over and over, I've seen it in places like Alexandria, which is one of the best examples in Arlington, that there are very high dense corridors along the metro, the subway route, and commitments were made decades ago that would not intrude into the residential area beyond a certain line. And to the credit of the officials there, they have honored that commitment, and the trust is there. And if you don't have that trust, then every single project becomes an immense battle, instead of having the community sit down with participation and say, okay, we understand that's in the area that we're going to do this. Now, what is it we really want there, and what should it look like? And the third thing with regard to the density is to have a flexibility for the private sector so that they can achieve the goals that the community and the government, the public sector want, but do it in a way that makes bottom line sense. Very few people in the private sector are in there without regard to the bottom line of what is going to happen to the business. With all of that, our goal becomes pretty straightforward. And that is that we want the jobs, we want the economic development, we want the shared prosperity. We want to also recognize at the same time, the other side of the equation is we have to be recognized that there are extraordinary cost savings and efficiencies for the public sector, the private sector, the nonprofit sector, if we do things differently. I will tell you the constant sprawl outward and the constant provision of police service and education service and ambulance service and everything else is simply not cost effective. And so what we have to start doing is thinking a little bit, how can we get better return on our public sector investments? There is a strong connection between these approaches and the smart growth principles that we're going to talk about. And in some ways, what is going on in America now is major driving forces that are pretty much saying either community is going to change or they're going to have a very tough time in the future. It's not just because I go around and give great speeches, and it's not just because, gee, this sounds nice. It's not just because this protects the environment and starts to deal with emissions. It's because the world is changing around us. And part of what is happening is the demographics. The two biggest changes in demographics, and you can see this from here, you can see the bubble coming out, and it's getting larger by every year, are the baby boomers and the millennials. Baby boomers and the millennials are driving the economy today. And what is happening is the baby boomers and millennials do not look for the traditional development patterns in the traditional communities. The millennials very much want a place where there is a there. They want a sense of place. They want to be able to, I have a son who's 38 and has his own business, and his former boss and I were talking about this before he went on his own. My son doesn't mind working to 9 o'clock at night. But when he goes down that elevator, and he lives in Washington, D.C. with his wife, and he goes down that elevator and crosses the street and meets a couple of his buddies who wants to have a drink. I'm assuming they're drinking coffee. But he goes across the way, has a drink, and then he gets on the subway, and he goes 2 stops, and he and his wife go out and they walk to dinner. And dozens of restaurants all around them in that area. This is what is developing more and more in terms of millennial preferences. No one is exactly sure why, but the millennials are not oriented to the traditional 1-acre, 2-acre subdivision with 4-bedroom homes. And in fact, one of the most interesting statistics is that the age for getting the driver's license is actually going up. Now, when I was growing up, and when my son was growing up, you couldn't wait until you were able to get the driver's license. And the number of young people getting a driver's license is actually going down. And the number of cars owned by the millennials is going down. The other part of that, and it goes hand in hand, is the baby boomers. And interestingly, what has happened here is a significant change of what it means to be a baby boomer. We were talking, Councilman Hoffman and I were talking about this earlier today, because most of you haven't noticed this, but I am a baby boomer. What used to be, when most of the provisions were put together for aging in this country, was based on certain expectations, and including, I'm talking about Medicare, Medicaid, 401k programs, retirement programs, everything else, and housing patterns, was based on a certain expectation of what was going to happen when you aged and retired. You retired at 60 and you died at 70. Now, I don't want to be crude, but that was pretty much the expectation, and everything was set up that way. Now, what we know is if you reach 60 in good health, statistically, you're going to reach 83 in good health. And so now your question is, do I want to sit on the back porch or senior home or go to South Florida for the next 25 years of my life? And the answer is no. I want to be active in the community. I want to do things. And I'm not talking about going to occasional concert or sporting event. In many cases, active also means I want to be an active part of the economy because I can't afford not to. Those pension programs put together and Social Security programs put together in the 1950s do not cover cost of the lifestyle in this whole century. And so we're seeing these dramatic changes taking place. You can see this in terms of, preferences and the great similarity between the preferences of the millennials and the baby boomers. Now, what does that mean as a practical matter? I mean, are we all going to jump around and say, well, gee, we love our young people and we love our seniors, and so let's change our entire development pattern and move to things like complete streets and mixed use and all that sort of stuff? Well, that would be nice, but it probably is not going to happen just for that reason. There's a fundamental reason that community after community is really making dramatic changes, and that is because of the economics of it. The economics are that businesses, and especially for the knowledge-based part of the economy, look at the near hysteria that is going on, for example, to try to attract the Amazon second headquarters. The knowledge-based part of the economy, the businesses know they have to be in a place where they can attract and retain the millennials. They know that the millennials are not going to go to the traditional office park. And in fact, we did a study, whenever I use the word we, it's not a royalness about me, it's meaning Smart Growth America. But we did a study called Core Values. You can go on our website and you can download it for free. But what we did is we looked at 500 companies that had relocated from either a rural but mostly suburban office park type setting. And we interviewed a large number of the executives that were involved in the decision, and we asked basically why they moved. And it's, in some cases, big ones like Boeing and going to downtown Chicago, or General Electric going from suburban Connecticut to downtown Boston, or Marriott moving from a suburban office park to downtown Bethesda and so on. So we asked why they moved. And what they said over and over, 82% level, the number one reason was to attract and retain the shiny brights coming out of college. The millennials that simply did not want to go to an office park and work and have nothing but a big parking lot around them, and then have to drive a 45-minute commute to go home to some suburban jurisdiction. That is just not what it is all about. If you want to see it locally, go look what's going on with one of the more famous research office parks in the country at one time, and that is the Raleigh Research Triangle. And when I first visited Raleigh Research Triangle, it was a typical office park that had major research firms in it, and labs and things of this type. I talked with the woman who was the executive director a number of years ago, I'm not sure she still is, but about what was happening, and they were starting to lose tenants, they were starting to lose occupants, and the reason being is that the major companies, depending on attracting the tremendous brain pool that is in the Raleigh-Durham area, found that the millennials wanted to work downtown. And so they are now redoing, if you go out there, totally reconstructing the Research Triangle. They are part of the movement that is behind the new transit lines coming in that will connect the Research Triangle to the 2 universities and to the 3 downtown areas. And this is one example, but that's kind of a large example. I always tell people the example that really hit me was about 10, 12 years ago, when my son was maybe 25 years old. He gave me a call one time, and he was out in Boise, Idaho, working, and he said, "Dad, have you ever been to Boise?" And at that time I had not. And he said, "You know, I really like it here. I could see myself living here." Well, I want to tell you, when you have an up-and-coming millennial, shiny bright, who looks at a community and says, "I like this, I could live here," you've won half of the economic development battle right there. Now, I also, by the way, have a 15-year-old daughter, and she rides horses competitively. And about 2 years ago, she had a bad fall and had a very bad concussion, and her outpatient treatment Silver Spring. If you've been to the Washington area, you probably know Silver Spring a little bit. But it used to be a five-corner intersection, but now it is probably one of the most prosperous and, if you will, hot communities in the area. And so we finished the doctor's appointment, we're walking out, and she looks around and she says, Dad, why don't we live in a neat place like this? And we live in downtown Annapolis, which is actually a pretty cool place. You know, the fact that a young teenager was looking at something and said, I want to live here. Again, Silver Spring, if you go there, it is just absolutely booming and extraordinarily prosperous. And so all of these areas, all of these things come together, and what we find is that as communities respond to these demands from the millennials and from the baby boomers, that increasingly they move toward more walkable communities. They move toward communities that have a much better mix of housing and other activities, mixed use, and they move to communities that have a certain sense of place about them. Now, having said that, one of the things that almost always happens when you hit the success button is that housing prices unfortunately go up. And the very thing we were talking about just a few moments ago. Housing prices go up and then force people out of the area. And so you can point to it and say, look at this tremendous success. That used to be an abandoned mill building. I remember when it was a used car lot in this corner. And look what's going on here. And look at this condominium over here. But where were the people that were there before? Where were the working families and the middle class that were there before? And in many cases, we find them, in fact, priced out of that immediate area, which is one of the major challenges facing us, so that we have to stop and think, even as we implement those tools that will help us really compete in this very competitive economy for the knowledge-based portion of the economy and for the shared prosperity, how do we do it to make sure that we don't become part of the problem? I'll tell you probably the most clear way that you see this. I work with the communities all over the country on advocacy for transit, for light rail, other types of transit, bus rapid transit, and so on. Even upgraded the bus systems, and normally have a approach. We normally work with the Chamber of Commerce and other business groups, as well as local leaders and all, about an advocacy for approval for transit. They almost always go to referendum. They almost always, for a new line, involve some type of additional tax. The most common is a half cent on the sales tax, and so you have to make a convincing case for the public to vote for it. And the arguments almost always are about jobs and economic development and increased prosperity, as well as environmental issues and things of this type. And so you're successful. And the success is not only with the usual carriages, meaning the Northeast, which is so liberal they vote for anything. And that's not where it's happening. What's happening now is in Memphis. You see in Charlotte, of course, and you see in Raleigh-Durham. But it's in Memphis, and it's in Knoxville, and it's in Austin, and it's in San Antonio, and jurisdiction after jurisdiction. And those jurisdictions are really the competition for Greensboro. You're not really in competition with Pittsburgh or New York, or for that matter, even completely with Charlotte. You're in competition with jurisdictions that are about your size, located elsewhere, and have very similar challenges, and all of a sudden have started taking off. Now, having said that, and having been part of the pitch, one of the things that we often find is, yes, it works exactly the way we said it would, except that we drive people out of the area where they were before. And so that's why we urge, before you really begin a major smart growth, major revitalization, major transit initiative, make sure that you put the tools in place to help continue the diversity that you want in the community, including the economic diversity. And so the question becomes then, what are the tools to address these changes and the preferences of the population groups that we're talking about? And how do we create places where people want to live and to work, and how can we do it and make sure that there is indeed a shared prosperity to that. There are a number of different tools, and I won't go through detail because of the timing, but I'm just going to list some of them, talk about them briefly, but urge you again to go to our website and go to all the different websites. So I'll be talking about complete streets. This may shock some people, but the street really shouldn't be just for cars and trucks. It also should be for pedestrians and bicycles and just the beauty of the community and so on, and not inhibit the economic growth by the changes. And so if you want to find more of those, just go to our websites and look at it. The first thing I would mention is mixed use. And in terms of mixed use, and I saw some good examples of it here in Greensboro, but what is really important elsewhere is to put together a type of mixed use, which is, by the way, how most humans existed most of their life. They worked over the store in the village part or whatever of this. And a mixed use means, and in many cases, like this particular one in Iowa City, they are often utilized mill shops, old hotels, department stores, things of this type. But it doesn't just happen. You have to change the laws and the policy and make it so that every single application doesn't become a detailed zoning battle and say, in this district, in this area, we want, and not only want, we will incentivize mixed use. And when I talk about incentivize, if you create a walkable community, and most local governments have rules that there are 2.4 parking spaces per residential community. And who knows where that ever came from, but it's been there forever. And so if you really have a walkable community or a transit-oriented community or whatever, and you expect most people to do most of their activities walking, why do you need 2.4 parking spaces? In fact, a little bit further, and there are tools to capture some of the incremental growth of this. Why require parking spaces be built by the private sector at all, and do it from a public policy perspective elsewhere? It's not only, as I mentioned, this is a medium-sized community, obviously, but it's even a smaller community. This is one of my favorite, in part because it's in Maryland, but it's a little place called Berlin, Maryland, on the eastern shore, agriculture area, about 600 families. About a decade ago, they adopted a whole new approach to development that relied on the historic structures they had, changed considerably their urban strips, made them mixed use, and that community is now absolutely booming. But most importantly, if you looked at what was happening, the community was becoming older and older, which meant the young people were moving out. Now, in the last 5 years, the community is becoming younger, which means that young people are moving back into this little rural community. Another example, and I don't want to say close by, but closer, is Greenville, South Carolina, that has done an extraordinary series of changes in this. Now, the reason we advocate so strongly for mixed use is beginning in the 1920s, we adopted Euclidean zoning, a technical term, but all it simply meant was residential is going to be over there, or retail is going to be over here, or jobs, employment, industrial is going to be over here, and keep them apart from one another. Beginning especially in the 1950s with the Interstate Highway and the GI Loan Bill and everything else, and I'll go through detail now, but that became the standard. And so what have we done? We have, in fact, produced a situation where most families now have to get into a 2,000-pound machine, a car, and drive 2 miles to buy 1 quart of milk. And think how many areas you see exactly that. And what we recognize is that most Americans take 7 trips a day, to and from work, kids to schools, stop at the dry cleaners, go out to dinner, whatever it might be. If even only 3 or 4 of those were walkable, think what impact you've had on everything from the health of the individual to the health of our planet, but most importantly, the desirability and therefore economic success of that community. And that brings you, of course, when you talk about mixed use, to the question of density. But what we have to understand about about density is not all density is created equal. And in fact, this is one that I just love to use. This is a project in Huntsville, Alabama. It came because of the research facilities in Huntsville, but the density here is 21 units per acre. And this is how most people think about density. This is what comes to their mind. And if you look what happens, and it's not as much this one. Is there a light here? Anyway, if you look carefully at what happens, a school over here, you have to get in a car and you have to drive down and around and all the way around here and back in to get to the school. And this is place after place that we have segregated everything you have to live, and with great deference, because I'm sure there are wonderful people living there. That's a rather, I don't want to say ugly, that would be mean, so let's say unattractive neighborhood. And why would they go there? Well, they go there because it is affordable, because they packed everyone in, they have no amenities and nothing else around them. That's 21 units per acre. This is what's called the Back Bay area of Boston. The Back Bay area that you see right there is 37 units per acre. And it is one of the most desirable communities in the entire country. Now, that's both the good news and the bad news. It's not essential. But it's one of the most desirable in the entire country. The reason I say good news and bad news, I mean, it wasn't always that way. It was kind of rediscovered back in the 1950s. But what has happened as well is you cannot buy one of those. You cannot buy one of those units for under about $2 million, and that is the unfortunate downside that I was talking about in this. Now, the changes in terms of there's a range in between how you do them and all. But the changes are possible because of policy changes and a focus on design. When we talk about density, we talk about mixed use, two words we really need to keep in mind is design and context. You want it to be done in the context of the neighborhood, and you want it to be done in a design that is to human scale, that is compatible, and is to the general scale of not just that area, but of what the community itself is thinking about. I live in a community that has 19 units per acre, and a little bit, not as much as we like, of mixed use, but it has all townhouses and condos, and it's also become part of Annapolis, an extraordinarily desirable neighborhood as well. So when I talk about design, if we look at what has happened in similar places, this is, I'm sorry, we're talking about density. This is Akron, Ohio. And the thing that I think is interesting about these is that if you notice there's an apartment building right in the middle of that. And back in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, this was normal to build to scale. And if you're driving down the block or walking down the sidewalk, unless you actually stop and look at that brick building in the middle, you would not recognize that is, I'm guessing, probably about a 10-unit apartment building built right in the middle of it. Now, we're not saying this is recommended for every community, but we are saying that this has historically been part of the approach. We talk about building a more range of housing that will meet economic needs of a variety of communities. This one is in Seattle, West Seattle. I've talked with the people in Seattle about this. It is designed to average 60% median family income for the Seattle metropolitan area. Now, 60%, by the way, in Seattle is still fairly high, but so are the housing costs. But over half of the housing units in here have one tool or another that keeps them in the 60% range. This is one that I don't find particularly inviting, but many people do, and it's because it's in a more, even more urbanized area. But this is in Berkeley. It is actually a 3-unit home that was converted from a larger single-family home. And as part of the tour today, we talked about the ongoing struggle families in or whatever, but there are a number of designs that have converted them into two-family units that are very attractive. It doesn't change anything from the exterior. But the other issue is very few families today want 4, 5, or 6 bedrooms. And most of these units have 4, 5, or 6 bedrooms. I came from a family with 6 siblings. My son does not yet have a child. My son is about to not yet have a child. My daughter is 15, and she says, I want to have a daughter. Who knows what will really happen. But that is, in fact, what's happening, except for the immigrant population. Even that is changing dramatically. The large number of bedrooms. So there are different approaches that should be used to this. The other issue the tool that we really ask people to focus on is the walkability. And the walkability comes down to what we call the complete streets. By the way, when I talked about core values, I meant to mention it, but if you notice on there, it had a walk score. And I don't know how many are familiar with the idea of a walk score, but you take any parcel of land, any place, and you say, what is the walk score? Meaning, what is the walkability of the 6 or 7 most essential things in your life? And so it would be schools, it would be libraries, it would be medical facilities, it would be employment opportunities, it would be retail opportunities, and so on. The higher the walk score, the more it means you have, as I suggest, walkability. Realtors across the country are now using walk scores as tools to help sell property. And what we find is that you can do this by focusing on something called complete streets. Complete streets simply means, as I said earlier, the street is for everyone, and you really want it walkable. Now, I'm going to create some controversy here because I know it's been ongoing discussion, but I've got to tell you, these 4-lane, one-way streets tearing through town with high speeds and all, that is not conducive to creating a walkable community. And in fact, I have no idea why, although I see it all across America, but I can tell you it is changing at a dramatic rate. The one-way patterns, what do? They bring commuters in and out of the community quicker, faster. Is that really what we want for our community? Or do we want a place where people can get around in the community? And the other thing that sounds strange, a well-designed community that has bicycle and that has wide sidewalks for pedestrians, landscape sidewalks, something between the cars and the people, 2 couples can walk past one another and things of this type. If you have a center strip in that is landscape, you can move more cars at a steady pace than if you have no center strip and everyone is cutting across and everyone is turning left and everything else, and you have stop signs and all constantly because of that. And so, and by the way, at a big scale, what we find is communities tearing down elevated roads, filling in recessed roads and all, because they recognize what has happened. But just some quick examples in terms of walkability. Back up a second. Oh, there's one that I missed there. This is the density in Seattle, a different version of density in Seattle. Okay, here we go. Hamburg, New York, an old industrial town. What you are seeing there as a complete street was, in fact, at one time, 4 lanes going straight down. And what they did was to narrow the lanes. When I was driving around today, I saw a number of 12-foot wide lanes. You don't need 12-foot wide lanes. In fact, so many jurisdictions now moving to 8-foot wide lanes. Truck Association immediately can tell you can't do that, but yes, you can. And prosperous places do it. What they have done as well is, and you can see it here, traffic calming devices. They've eliminated all of the intersections like that. You see a focus on pedestrian crossings. You see the narrowing of the street. You see the bike lanes on both sides. And this is a fairly common model. Large communities and small communities, but this is what helps create a sense of place. Not only places like Hamburg, but this is in a semi-residential neighborhood in New Jersey, where they decided the best thing that they could do on it was focus on the center strip and you see the parking and what they have done in general. Another one that I found interesting, it's supposed to be South Bend, but that's not South Bend, is it? No. What happened to South Bend? This must be South Bend. But in any case, all the different varieties of what you can see across the country. There's several essential things. Sidewalks for people. By the way, when you talk about crime, the best single anti-crime criminal activity is to have people on the street. I know just like our narrower lanes, it sounds counterproductive. Criminals don't commit crimes generally and miss a whole bunch of people. And so you want people on the street. The second thing is you want some landscaping. It doesn't have to be these huge trees like this. You want life on the street, which means go ahead and encourage the outflow from the cafes and the coffee shops and things of this time. You want either the burial or at least removing from the sidewalks the electric posts and things of this type. There was one in Washington, D.C. where my office is, and I live in Annapolis, and so I used to drive back and forth, and they were redoing this major road, New York Avenue, and I saw them putting in sidewalks on the side that was not there. I said, this is wonderful because there's several economically stressed neighborhoods around there, and I didn't go down that road for several weeks, and I come back, and there was a huge telephone pole right in the middle of this brand new brick sidewalk, and I saw this young lady with a double stroller stepping off onto New York Avenue to get around the pole that was in the middle of the new sidewalk. I called the mayor, and they fixed it, but I want to tell you, it wasn't an inexpensive fix, and so this is the type of things that we're looking at. An important part of all of this is how do you go about if you want to fund some other approaches. If you want to make sure that you have community opportunities for housing and things of this type. One of the things that's emerging, and there's so many different tools to use this, but it's a value capture approach. Value capture approach simply means if public activities significantly increase the value of property, then some reasonable portion of that increased value can go to public purpose. Now, that sounds strange, and if you think about it, you'll say, oh, this is another leftist solution or something. But it's something we've done for years and years and years in parking districts, for example, where we have tax incremental financing. We have tax incremental financing where if you build a new structure and you're not required to build all the same parking, but there's a certain tax that goes on top of the building, and that tax goes in to support the construction of parking elsewhere. But if increased value comes from public action could be a new transit station, public action could be investment that totally revitalizes the neighborhood, public action could be increasing the density, increasing the mixed use. But if that increased value comes, then should there be a mechanism in place, and it might be a tax or it could be a variety of other things. In other words, an automatic given. Okay, at least 30% of the rental units in this new facility will be at a price of 80% average family income for the immediate community. And so what you're doing then is building housing that will help people in that area, stay in that area, and help others in that economic range come to that as well. There are other tools. Maryland, for example, has started the Smart Growth Investment Fund. It's a mix of state and private funds to help finance the smart growth projects. But most importantly, what happens under this is under U.S. tax laws, private sector investments in these funds are exempt from capital gains tax. Now, I'm sure everyone glazed over when they heard that. I didn't see anyone jump up with excitement. But what it means is for people in the building and development community, one of the biggest issues they always face is the capital gains on a successful project. But if you do it through a fund that incorporates other purposes, and then when you take your yield out from there, that is treated as ordinary income and not as capital gain. Ordinary base income, not a supplemental income or anything of this type. There's other approaches. The district District of Columbia actually puts, and it's a big figure, they put $100 million a year into a fund that is designed to help offset costs in private sector projects for initiatives that the public has decided it wants in that community. We also must recognize that the focus on design and a sense of place has such an important impact, but it also means changes in planning and zoning that recognizes the needs of the community, that focuses on pedestrian well-being, that focuses on issues of design, that recognizes that in some areas, for example, ancillary dwelling units are considered a bad word, and yet not every senior wants to live in a 4-bedroom house. And so that was started when there was a fear that somehow or other it was going to mean all kinds of poor people were going to move into the neighborhood or something like that. We're not talking, we've got to address that issue and challenge as well, but what we're talking about literally are people who no longer want the 3 or 4 bedroom house, but can't afford the $300,000 alternative downtown. In the district where my son lives, the U Street corridor, which was so destroyed during the riots back in the late 60s and 70s, and for years lay dormant. Also, was discovered it has become a major place, and everyone who looks at it says, "Isn't this wonderful? This is a miracle." You cannot buy a condominium on the U Street corridor today for under $600,000. And so you have to ask yourself, where did all these people go? Well, a lot of them moved out to suburban communities, my old county, Prince George's County, and now what happens? They have to take a couple of hours of their day, and they have to pay the cost to get back to the U Street corridor where the jobs are. Now, we can do better than that. We can do a lot better than that, and the tools are available to do exactly that. A quick thing, and it's emerging at a rapid pace all across the country that they want to consider, and please go to our complete street. It has all the details of how to implement them and how to work with the public on it and so on. But another thing that, I'm sorry, I'm supposed to show it to you. This one, interesting enough, is in Brooklyn. This is not the traditional view of Brooklyn, but it's the complete street going there. By the way, I heard a couple people earlier today when we were talking about fear of if you do these changes and make it pedestrian oriented, put the bicycles on there, people won't stop for pedestrians at all. I hope you saw the news story that last year New York City had 0 pedestrian deaths. New York City, 0 pedestrian deaths. They had about a couple weeks ago the first 2 pedestrians to die for a while, and that was when someone lost control of a car and actually hit them as opposed to a pedestrian crossing or whatever. But this one is from Brooklyn. This one is South Bend, Indiana. Those are mostly old industrial mills back there in the complete streets, and you can see what has happened by having retail on all the ground floor and making it walkable. They did take away 2 lanes on that middle street to do that. And the other approach that we want to make quick reference to is just starting, it's been around for a while, but just starting really to catch on, but it's form-based zoning. And in form-based zoning, what you end up is a part of a zoning code that's based on the form that you want. And so what your focus is, what is on the outside of the building? What does the building look like? And how does it interact with the neighborhood and the community and what you want? And how does it relate to the street scheme and so on? And who cares what goes on inside of the building? Now, I understand that sometimes that was misconstrued. And so let me put it this way. Who cares whether it's residential, whether the residential is condo or apartment, or whether it is office, or whether it's retail, or whether it's even what is catching on everywhere now, micro-manufacturing. The small manufacturing that does not have any noxious fumes or odor or sound or whatever going out into the community. And maybe it ought to be a wonderful mix of all of that. And for a builder, when you say, if the market starts to change a little bit, you have a right to change as long as you go with the form that was agreed upon. The form-based zoning, it works with great community input and without that community input. It also, by the way, encourages design and creates a sense of place. And some other examples, this is the form-based code in Cincinnati, in which they just put together what they're seeking on the outside. You can see from there, I understand. And they don't care really, again, what goes on the inside in terms of a mix of different activities. It creates a place really where people want to be, and it draws businesses. If you want to see a good example of it, you go to Macon, Georgia, right outside of Atlanta. There's the downtown urban area and one of the major boulevards, Ponce de Leon Boulevard, all form-based zoning, in which the community got together and said, this is what we want. And they said, in the downtown area, Macon, we want retail on the ground floor, everywhere. And they also said, we don't want buildings over a certain height. And I forget what, my memory is correct, from having visited there, it's probably 5 stories. You don't want it over a certain height, and we want it built up to the street, and we want, there were 2 or 3 other things in the architectural design. And Macon, Georgia has become extraordinarily successful. In fact, if you're looking at the street, even things like parking garages. I saw a number of parking garages here, and I understand that's a debate about. One of the issues is, and jurisdiction is doing this everywhere now, on the street side, that should not be a parking garage. On the street side, it should be retail, where people walk along, and so you have a coffee shop, and you have a bookstore, and you have a small dress store, or whatever it might be. And then you just have an entrance to the garage. And the building itself, why these ugly concrete buildings? I see jurisdictions, I mentioned Silver Spring before, go look at that. It looks like a building. It looks like either an office building or an apartment building with the brick, and they even have false windows in there. And it gives a sense of place when it in fact is a garage for 600 cars or whatever. And it's that type of thing that we should be looking much more toward. One of the things that we want to emphasize is that given the great divide in the country, many of the tools that we're talking about, and I know we didn't go into detail here, but the things we were talking about and trying to do, have as their ultimate goal the shared prosperity. We want to create an economy that is strong enough and is growing for more and more people to buy into it, and at the same time that reduces 2 of the most fundamental costs to most families, and that is the cost of transportation and the cost of housing. We should also recognize that Greensboro is in part of a global economy, and your competition is looking at exactly these issues, and they're making dramatic changes. And you all travel around, so I mean, you've seen what has happened in terms of taking off. And I can tell you that unless some of the changes are made, it's going to be really difficult to compete. And it might start sliding the other direction. It also is about you need higher jobs infused into the economy, higher paying jobs into the economy as well to achieve a shared, your employment rate could be 0. But if everyone's still struggling desperately and can't afford the housing and pays an inordinate amount of their price for transportation, what have you really gained? And so the competition is very real. Creating a quality place is something that becomes so very important. This is Nashville. Curiously enough, and most of my life I only thought of Nashville as a country and western place. It has taken off in a major way, including the new library of Memphis as well. This is your competition. There's no question about it. Their downtown area may be a little bit more urbanized than you want, but that has actually largely been urbanized because of the country and western industry in the past, entertainment district. But this is what they are doing in terms of livability and walkability and competition. The other one that I mentioned before, but a slightly different picture of it, is Berlin, Maryland, to show you a very small town. And they now have their first micro-manufacturing companies moving in there. They're very small. They employ about 25 people, and they're making high-tech facility, and they're in any one of those buildings right there. And that is the type of doing. As you go through all of this, I think it comes down to a few critical questions to sum things up. And the critical question has got to be one really that impacts you and the family. people will not do, and we can't expect our elected officials to do some of these changes just because it would be nice, it would be environmental, it would be attractive, or you have a really great speaker come in and tell you this is what we should be doing. Instead, you have to ask, I think, some fundamental questions, and that is, where do our kids live after they graduate from college? I mean, are they coming back to your basement? You'd be surprised what percentage is doing that across America. Are they going to even come back to Greensboro? Do they want to come back to Greensboro? A question becomes, where will your parents live as they decide it's time to retire or maybe move into a slightly less active? Are they going to find a place right in downtown here or in one of the communities here? Or are they going to be forced to move to a purely residential retirement area well outside of the area? One of the ones that has really been a success story, Charlottesville, Virginia. By the way, I forgot to mention Charleston, South Carolina, which is also doing so well. But when you think of density, think of the children, think of your parents, think of the whole community that wants to thrive and live in that area, and say, what changes should we make to help create this sense of place, to create this shared economy? And that's what smart growth and smart growth planning is all about. That will build your economy. It's the basis not only of a strong economy, but a shared economy with housing available for everyone. And the only thing I can emphasize in the strongest terms, we're not in isolation. You are in fierce competition with other jurisdictions, even if it is not day-to-day in front of you. Let me conclude here and take a few questions, personal comments, attacks, whatever is appropriate.
I've also heard the governor speak many times, and I also know in talking with Brian at Smart Growth America, he said, yeah, 20, 25 minutes, plenty of time for questions. He said, don't worry, we'll write a 20-minute speech. You'll see where it goes from there. But it was wonderful. Thank you. One thing before we take questions, in case some of you might want to scoot out, we handed you a card, and a little slightly bigger than an index card with 3 questions on it when you came in, because we want to get your feedback. How does this work? How do you feel about Greensboro? And I was totally remiss in not introducing Mayor Nancy Vaughn and Councilwoman Hopping. We appreciate you being here. I apologize for that. And with that, we have time for a few questions for the governor.
Although, as I said, you have the option there. Questions, comments, personal attacks. I'm used to all 3 of them. I said personal attacks.
You showed yes. You showed a slide of the town or the streetscape that was formerly 4 lanes, I believe.
Yes.
And then now 2.
Yes.
And had a bicycle path, and then cars on the side, parking spaces.
Right.
And my question is, why aren't cars? Why not push the cars out and put the bicycle path inside them, so that you have lanes of traffic, then cars park, and then the bicycle path? I've seen that in Europe. I haven't seen that in too many years.
In a number of communities in the United States, what you're saying is becoming much more the norm. It is, I think, just moving from one stage to another. You're absolutely right about Europe. I was there with my family in London in August and saw it everywhere. And it just, I think, comes down a little bit of working with the local community, including the business community, and working with the existing infrastructure. What combination of those things go together. But if I could wave a wand and have a preference, I would do it exactly the way you're talking about. And there are other approaches as well. If you were starting from new on a lot of these, you wouldn't even have parking in the front of the buildings. You would have easy access to parking in the back. But much of our infrastructure, both public and private, is already there, so that's not an option as much. And you have to work with the business community and their needs for customer accessibility and worker accessibility and so on. So it's just a matter of compromise, and your point is very well taken and very valid in many communities, and I think will be increasingly the norm. Other questions? Yes.
You had talked about 4
work with personally. There's an organization that's been around for a number of years. It's called Form-Based Code Institute. And they just recently, that is 3 or 4 months ago, merged with Smart Growth America. And they are now part of Smart Growth America as well. And part of the reason they did is that we have found that more and more communities that we're working with have asked about the form-based zoning. Now, I don't know as much of the details of how to actually implement it. I do know several of the broad principles, and that is, it doesn't work for the entire city. I think it would be a mistake to try to do it for the entire city. You pick a district that you really want, and the aspirations for that district can be considerably different. One might be very much a community, family-oriented with some retail and some employment opportunities and all. Another might be much more a tourism, entertainment area and so forth. But then you work with the community, and by the community I mean both the people and the business sector as well as the elected officials from there, and to say, what things do we really want to see when we walk down that street, and what things do we really not want to see? And that's what the Cincinnati Code was all about, and they just built exactly this. It's almost like a checkbox, you know. Are you building up to the sidewalk? Are you building mixed use with retail on the ground floor? Are you no higher than whatever Cincinnati's code was? Will your facades be equal to, and in many cases for a place like that, there'll be a brick facade. And will you have landscaping between the sidewalk and the street? And check enough of them, and you're eligible then for that project within that. And by the way, the community in many cases signs off on a project as much as the public sector does. In other words, is this consistent with that? And it's working. And so as we got more and more demands for this, speaking around the country, we started working with the Institute, and they're now part of Smart Growth America, and they are either up on or will be shortly part of our website, which is very, very easy, www.smartgrowthamerica.org.
Form-based coding, does that actually equal higher tax values for the area that decide to do it?
Not necessarily. It's 2 separate questions. It wouldn't surprise me if some jurisdictions did try to merge them, but most of the early examples in the form-based zoning do not relate to any type of tax change or tax structure. The one exception being that a couple of jurisdictions, in the interest of not having parking in front of every business, and I understand why. If you have a grocery store, you have a drugstore or whatever, and you're dependent on people coming from elsewhere, you need parking. And so one of the things that has happened in a number of form-based zoning, they say no parking in front of the building, but we will provide adjacent parking as part of the public, but then there's a tax incremental financing that goes on that parcel that helps support just the parking. But even that's not required. They're 2 separate issues. How about the last question right here? I'm getting a subtle signal by student walking down here.
Well, first I was going to say, I Googled you while you were talking, and people also searched for Thomas Jefferson. So I wish that was me. Sue recently did another coup here for our community in getting the National Realtor Association to do their preference housing and transportation or mobility. Great stuff in there. I work in transportation and transit, passionate advocate for enhancing transit here in our region. How do we leverage information like that, that is what the people are saying that they want? And how do we really make that happen and use that information to its best advantage?
First of all, let me just say that the National Board of Realtors years ago adamantly opposed to all the stuff we're talking about, as well as infringement on property rights. Then they moved to somewhat support, and they created a portion. They actually have a division of the National Association of Realtors. They have a division that now is a Smart Growth division. They've now increasingly folded this into their general standards, and most realtors learn the detail of the walk score and how to use it and so on. And so there's become a dramatic change. The question of how to incorporate it, the information is available. It's readily available, and a lot of the groups that are involved with this are advocacy groups in themselves. And increasingly, builders and real estate people come to realize that if you put a really well-designed project that is mixed-use compatible, you get such a higher yield. And so you start looking toward that. I would go to the associations themselves. The biggest one, and I'll conclude with this, is the change in attitude toward transit. Transit increasingly, in almost all forms, is not only growing dramatically, but is being approved by the voters, generally with a tax. Since 2000, there were 240 referenda across the country about tax issues for either enhancing or starting a new transit system. 82% of those were approved by the voters, and as I said, they're in 8 typical areas. I thought it was actually kind of funny that the biggest movement for no new taxes coming out of Texas, and Houston approved that extra penny on the sales tax so they can build this new regional transit station. And so they're opposed to taxes, but if it's in our neighborhood and does good things in our neighborhood, fine. So mostly it's about making the connections, the information is there, and they have the advocacy, they have reasons to be there. There's several transit associations that get out there pretty aggressively. We formed actually a political action group that works on that to Smart with America as well. Our effort being to continue with federal funding for transit. Why don't I stop here? I know everyone's hungry, tired, thirsty. We're going to rush out, get on the computers, and look up the website. So, thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. So, yes, we want your feedback, and I'm going to recognize Nick Scarsey from the Greater Greensboro Realtors Association that partnered with us to get that grant mark. And we got a smart growth grant from the NAR to do that just for Greensboro. We were the first in the country to do this at a city level, just saying, yay, Greensboro. And the results, Dick Barron did a small story last week. We're hoping to leverage it. He's hoping to leverage it into a bigger story. But you can go, we will post the survey on our website. And we will use that information. What they're talking about is it was a survey of 410 residents of Greensboro. I'm forgetting my stats, but it was a stratified random sample, so it covered economics, diversity, racial diversity, age diversity, and it is a scientifically sound sample. It has a margin of error, I think it's plus or minus 4. So it gives you a good sense. We're going to use it, Mark, for the comp plan, not as the definitive, but a good starting point for conversation. So we will have another speaker in 2 weeks from today, tomorrow's Wednesday. Mr. Lineberger, who's a friend of Governor Glendening's, was a very successful developer in the 80s and became more and more interested in smart growth and new urban